Greetings, I'm Shad, and the time is finally here. Oh yes, oh yes. It is time to go through sword names, or terminology, or just names in general. So, what we see here are three representations of swords. Two I made of myself, and the other one I didn't need to make because I had a synthetic version of it. So, let's get right into it. Now, if we take our education from such sources as pop culture, Dungeons and Dragons, Skyrim, we would look at these three examples, generally the archetypal examples of swords, and we would say, oh yes, that's definitely a short sword, and this, we would say this is a long sword, and this is clearly a two-handed sword, so that's a great sword, right? Wrong! Dungeons and Dragons is an excellent resource to learn about swords, their function, use, and their terminology, their names, also how they fit into a historical context. Not! Sorry, getting a little carried away there, but my frustration comes from misinformation. Oh yes, misinformation. I don't know where they got the idea that these swords are named this, short sword, long sword, and great sword. Because it couldn't be further from the truth. Those are not the names, alright? Now, don't get me wrong. Dungeons and Dragons is wonderful. I played it since I was 12 years old, alright? I've had many countless hours of fun with that game. It has its flaws, alright? Including how it perceives and represents medieval weaponry. So we're going to at least look at that. But of course, Dungeons and Dragons isn't the only culprit. I mean, Skyrim and many other video games and other role-playing games are very much the same, probably because they get the terminology from having played games like Dungeons and Dragons, the more classical, things that go back in the day. So what are the names of these swords? To begin with, there is no historical dictionary for the universal names of swords, because oftentimes a sword in history was simply called a sword in their actual language. And there are actually swords that have multiple names, but there are some classic names, key terms that have come to be used in the modern day to refer specifically to certain types of swords. They're used by historians and they've come to represent that. So what are the names of these swords? Now, if you, like me, were misled by Dungeons and Dragons and video games, you would probably assume that this sword is a short sword! Well, you'd be right, it is a short sword. Alright, so they got one correct. Short sword, it is a sword that is short. Haha. Then we come to this sword, alright? This one you'll recognize as the classic one-handed knight-like sword, often used in conjunction with a shield. It is a sword that comes up quite a lot. Now, as we mentioned before, the incorrect term is to think that this is a longsword. It is actually not a longsword at all, okay? The classic one-handed sword used by the knight, or a sword to be used in conjunction with a shield, is actually called an arming sword. And if I was to use my Australian accent, an arming sword, or an arming sword, or an arming sword, whatever. Sorry, an arming sword. All right? That's what it is. That's its name. Record it in your memory banks. Now, the longsword is a historically used word, but it's also a descriptive word. It's describing a sword that is long. But what is a sword that is long? If you're comparing an arming sword to a short sword, well, an arming sword is longer than a short sword. And so that term, you think, well, it could apply. And probably in some historical cases it was. The Roman Sparta, for instance, was the longer version of their gladius. It has a lot of similarities with the Viking sword. And so, because there was no other longer equivalents of that sword, you could very rightly call the Sparta a longsword. But we're looking at the classic European examples of the high medieval period. So we're going to stick with that. And so, if we take the terms that have become classically identified with certain sword profiles, we will have a short sword here. We'll have arming sword here. And here is what is called a long sword. An actual long sword is a two-handed sword. But there are other swords in games that are not represented here. These are just light one-handed, normal one-handed, we go up to two-handed. Are there any other swords in the middle? Well, there is a sword that is very widely known of, and let's take a look at that one. Yes, I know, the swords have changed position. Alright, so, short sword, arming sword, we have long sword, but what is this sword that's come here? It's kind of a cross between an arming sword and a long sword. Well, the sword that we're talking about that you'll probably have realised is the bastard sword, also called a hand-and-a-half sword. Now, the bastard sword is an interesting one because in certain games it's given its own category or class, that it can be used as a one-handed weapon and as a two-handed weapon. What they often miss is that the long sword can actually be used the same. It can be used in one hand. Pause there. You need to understand that it is not an effective weapon in one hand. Yes, you could use it to a level of effect, but it's not made to be used in one hand. It is a two-handed weapon. The one-handed use of a longsword is really for grappling type moves where you can grab the opponent and do nice stabby things like that, or you can release and hold it by the pommel to get a much longer thrust. And you actually keep, a lot of control over the sword even though it's in one hand. But that does not change the fact that the longsword is a two-handed weapon. So yes, the longsword can be used with one hand, and though you can use it in conjunction with a shield, you'd be better off using an arming sword, which is made for it. Everything I've talked about in regards to the longsword applies to the bastard sword equally as much. It can be used in one hand or two hands, but it was never made to be used in conjunction with a shield. Though yes, it can be done, and there's probably historical examples of a longsword or bastard sword being used with a shield. You would be better off using an arming sword. There's always exceptions. I mean, you have a bit more reach with the bastard sword and longsword, so hey, why not? But it's about control, articulation of the wrists, alright? And you get all of that in spades with the arming sword. Now what we need to understand is that the bastard sword is a subclass of longsword. So what that means is every bastard sword is actually a longsword. You can call this a longsword, pointing to the bastard sword, and you'd be perfectly justified in doing so because it is a longsword. But not every longsword is a bastard sword, okay? So you would not get away with calling this sword a bastard sword. But in many role-playing games and video games, that seems to be where the longsword has been relegated to. If they have the bastard sword, well no, that's where the longsword is, and then we can jump right up to greatsword. What I'm saying here is people like me who have been misled with pop culture, role-playing games, video games, need to change our understanding of where the longsword fits in. The longsword is not a hand-and-a-half sword. It is not a bastard sword. It is a two-handed sword. And so if you currently think a greatsword is as described by role-playing games, video games, what you are actually thinking of is a longsword. All right? Your understanding of a greatsword is in fact a longsword. Why am I saying this? Well, for one, the sizes of the greatswords in many video games are the sizes of longswords. You see, longswords have a bit of room to move. We've seen that longswords can be smaller, but they can actually be bigger too. And when we look at this sword here, many people would consider this sword to be greatsword size. Resting on the ground, look at where this sword comes up to on me. This is a big sword. So yes, you would actually be justified in calling this a greatsword because guess what? There are historical examples of greatswords being this small. This would be considered the small end of a greatsword, and it would be in a greatsword profile. But that doesn't mean it is a greatsword because there are long swords that go up to this size as well. So what defines the difference when a sword when a sword is in this size? Is it a longsword or is it a greatsword? Is it just the profile? If it has a ricasso with lower quillons and a nice long handle and maybe some side rings there, will that make it a greatsword? No, I don't think it does. You see, a greatsword is its own beast, and if you want to find out what makes a greatsword and different to a longsword, check out my video when longswords become greatswords, alright? I'll go in more detail there because there's a bit to cover. But for now, trust my word that this is not a greatsword. And because I know if myself looking in the past, if I saw this and I was trying to define swords based on what I knew from pop culture, role-playing games, video games, I would definitely consider this a greatsword. So that's why I say your understanding of greatswords who have been fooled just like me in the past? No. Our understanding of greatsword, we need a switch. That's actually a longsword. The classic two-handed sword is a longsword. The sword that Aragorn uses in Lord of the Rings. The sword he has before he's king and after, those are longswords. The sword Conan the Barbarian has, yes, it's a longsword. And it's actually a rather short longsword if you take a look at it. There's another reason why these three swords, all longswords, all different sizes of longsword, are not great swords. And there's a very key reason why they aren't great swords as defined in role-playing games especially, because they don't have a key feature that real great swords do have in real life. What am I talking about? Reach. Great swords are huge. They give reach. Look at how flaming long this is. Look at this. If I lean, I can get I'm touching both walls without even stretching as far as I can. Great swords are huge. If you're looking at a proper greatsword in correct proportions, it is at least going to come up to your head. It can even be higher. Greatswords are massive. And the greatswords in video games and role-playing games don't offer that key feature or advantage in the statistics of the rules or in the gameplay. And oftentimes, they just don't show them to be big enough. Now, you need to understand proper greatsword proportions because there are the fantasy, swords that are as big as a person, but they're as wide as some big person's hip. Like my own. You see, greatswords only reach this size by having thin blades and nice long handles. The greatsword really is its own beast. You would be much better and more accurate in understanding how they are fought with if you were to look at it as a polearm, not a sword. You see, a greatsword is too big. It's way too big. It can't be fought with the way you fight with a sword. You can't parry, you can't do things that a blade hits the ground. That's why there's a whole different type of sword fighting with greatswords. There are old treatises that show greatsword techniques, and they are all based around their huge size, which means it requires a completely different type of fighting. Now granted, a lot of these swords are different, but there's many of the techniques you can use between them. The parries, you can use the same wrist articulation. Not with this sucker! This sucker's huge! So what this means is that most video games, role-playing games, pop cultures and stuff don't even have true examples of greatsword. The greatsword is the forgotten sword. That's actually kind of accurate because the greatsword is not a high medieval sword. It actually came about during the Renaissance period. It's a much later period sword than all of these. And so it's actually not an inaccurate thing to not include the greatsword in the lineup of swords, because you would have your short sword, your classic one-handed arming sword, and then the two-handed sword or the long sword. And that's what we need to understand. The two-handed sword, when you think of two-handed sword, is the long sword. You can think, that can refer to a great sword. It is a great sword. You can only use it in two hands, so therefore it must be a two-handed sword. But again, let's look at that in my other video, because a great sword, you can't fight with it like a sword. And to me, that means it is not necessarily a sword. It makes it a whole different beast altogether. So this is the progression of sword sizes, and we've now understand the classic names. Now, we do have to remember that these names did not always identify these swords in their historical context, but that's what we use now, okay? And most of them are accurate enough, and that's what we use. So we have short sword here, arming sword here, long sword, the larger and smaller version of longsword. It's kind of funny, we've given a name to the smaller version of longsword, but we haven't really given a name to the larger version of longsword because it gets so confusing. Greatsword or longsword? Again, next video. And then of course we have a true greatsword, the beast, the big one, okay? So there you have it. I hope we can all now go forward using the correct names for the correct swords. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.